All right, y'all. Well, this is our last teaching session of our 4 weeks of lessons and 5 weeks of conversation for our new member class. So today we are going to talk kind of all about what the heck is going on right now in the denomination. So I'll kind of do brief bullet points. And again, as I mentioned in class, what's amazing is I'll share these things and then Bruce is like, oh, I was there. So Bruce can add some perspective to some of these details. But we're going to start with kind of the history of 50 years ago, the introduction of human sexuality, and then how over time it's evolved. We're going to kind of run through that history quickly. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about more recently what has developed and what our thoughts are regarding the next steps for the denomination, and then where grace fits into all of that. So as Bruce mentioned, in 1972, there was the introduction of the exclusionary language that was added from the floor, and that was then kind of implemented in 1976. As we talked about in class, every 4 years, General Conference meets, and so a lot of these details are following that 4-year quadrennium cycle. And so pretty much immediately there was talk of schism, and again, that's changed and evolved over time. But in 1976, that is when the details regarding the prohibition of funding for groups that were affirming of homosexuality. So there are different layers of how kind of legally this conversation of human sexuality has evolved, originally starting with the introduction of the exclusionary language. Then there was this focus on prohibiting any funds towards caucuses, agencies, groups that were supportive of homosexuality. And then over time, the conversation shifted because people realized that the exclusionary language was in kind of housed in the social principles. And we talked about the social principles briefly, but that's not our Constitution. The Constitution is the book of discipline. And so folks realized that when it came to things like ordination, who got to be pastors and clergy, there was no explicit language restricting anyone, whether they were straight or gay, openly or not, regarding whether they could be a pastor. And so there were a couple pastors appointed who were openly gay that kind of rocked that conversation. In 1977, Paul Abels is an openly gay pastor in New York City. He was sent to Judicial Council for being openly gay, and Judicial Council said there was nothing to charge because nothing was in the Book of Discipline, banning him from being a part of a leader in ministry. Similarly, in 1982, Julian as an openly gay pastor, was appointed by Bishop Wheatley in Denver, and complaints were filed, and ultimately it was dismissed because, again, there was no language in the Book of Discipline regarding exclusion from ordination. So then, in 1984, that language was introduced, saying that the clause stated, since the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be accepted as candidates, ordained as ministers, or appointed to serve in the United Methodist Church. So that was 1984. And then over the next decade or so, different things happened. There was a committee on homosexuality that was kind of commissioned in 1988, and their job was to kind of do biblical, historic research to see, where God's Spirit might be moving in that conversation. And in 1992, they presented their findings saying that, based on the 7 biblical reference to homosexuality, it's representative of ancient culture, not the will of God. Homosexuality is not to be considered a mental health issue. Committed monogamous homosexual relationships that are covenantal in nature should be affirmed. And so this was the response of the committee that was commissioned to do this work, and ultimately their report was rejected, and the exclusionary language was maintained. The next piece is in 1996. That was when the prohibition of pastors facilitating same-sex weddings occurred, and so that became the next layer of exclusion. And this kind of all built up to 2016. And 2016, I wasn't attending, but talking to anyone who was attending, the anxiety in the room and just the tension was immense. Everyone knew there was this verge of split very, very close to happening. And so that led to the Council of Bishops, so our executive branch, bringing forth the following. They said that all votes regarding human sexuality should be deferred, and they're going to refer the entire subject to a special commission to be named by the Council of Bishops. And this commission would develop a complete examination of the issue, and it could include possible revision of every part of the discipline regarding human sexuality. And the work would kind of all be thrown to a 2 to 3 day called General Conference that would be held in 2019 in St. Louis. And so this is, we're on the verge of splitting, and the hope was that this commission would bring forth different plans and proposals that would offer a way forward that would be approved and voted upon in 2019, so that then the next quadrennium, 2020, could kind of usher in that newness. So before we kind of dive a little bit deeper, I don't know, Bruce, if you have anything to add about any of that history or...
The only thing I would add is when you look at that history, you can't understand, because all of the commissions that were appointed and all of the leading thought that was taking place in the denomination, including the Council of Bishops, it was all to get rid of the exclusionary language, that there was no Christian biblical prohibition, and the exclusionary language was just out of sort with our tradition and who we are. Then why was that rejected? And it was rejected because of a coalition that was built vote-wise at General Conference between the conservative element of the United Methodist Church legislatively in the United States, which is a minority of the U.S. votes, combined with the African Conference votes. And though that coalition was built to where they simply said, well, that's what the commission that we appointed said, but we don't agree with it because it is not compatible with our understanding of the Christian faith. And so that's the reason why good logical study, biblical study, thoughtful interviews, thoughtful work was rejected for over a 20-year period.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the last 3-4 years have been tumultuous. The Commission on the Way Forward was created in October of 2016, and there were 32 people on that commission. It was diverse in nature. There were 8 bishops as members, 3 as moderators, laity, deacons, elders, clergy, from 9 different countries. And there were 3 openly gay members and then 2 leaders of the Wesleyan Covenant Association. And so the Wesleyan Covenant Association is something that has emerged out of this conversation of human sexuality. So after 2016, the cohort that Bruce is talking about, a good majority of them decided to have conversations of how they might be able to organize as a separate entity. And again, that's changed over time of what that identity looks like. But the Wesleyan Covenant Association, they would say that their role is to adhere to Wesleyan principles. They see their authority as biblical, and so looking to the Bible being the clarifying authority for them. And their statement on marriage is, "We believe marriage and sexual intimacy are good gifts from God. In keeping with Christian teaching through the ages and throughout the Church Universal, we believe that marriage is the uniting of one man and one woman in a single exclusive union. We believe that God intends faithfulness in marriage and celibacy in singleness." And so this group is a traditional group that has emerged. It is not strictly U.S., but majority of the members are from the United States, with some other members from outside the U.S. And they, over the last 3 years, have organized and basically created essentially their own denomination. They've not formally separated, we'll get to that later, but they were meeting in their own conferences. They have created their own constitution, book of discipline. So they've just basically created their own space so that they can operate as they feel God is leading them. And so the Wesleyan Covenant Association is the representation of the conservative, more traditional voice. So anyways, General Conference happens in 2019. This is a special session. This is not in the 4 years, and it's held in St. Louis, Missouri for 2 to 3 days to talk only about human sexuality. You can ask Bruce. General Conference is 2 weeks typically, and you talk about everything. But this is only about any of the language regarding human sexuality. I was actually in attendance of this conference, and to put it briefly, it was one of the most horrifying things to see. It was, people were, regardless of what position you took, people were miserable. There was fighting, there was not seeing eye to eye. It just was not the church in any stretch of the imagination, and there was a lot of brokenness in that. But that General Conference brought forth, so that commission that was tasked by the Council of Bishops recommended different plans to General Conference. There were probably three seriously considered, four that were offered. One was the traditional plan. And so that plan is basically everything stays as is and takes it a step further, saying that not only are we going to maintain the exclusionary language for LGBTQ persons, we are going to have mandatory minimums when it comes to penalties. And more stipulations, but it was basically status quo with more teeth. That's what the traditional plan was. The connectional plan was probably the most complicated of the plans offered. It kind of was trying to restructure the denomination. And so while I think perhaps over time it would have been a fruitful plan, naming that we are all, connected a little more loosely, because context matters. Because of the hoops that it would be needed to jump through regarding like the votes that you would need to vote upon, the amendments, it would have to be approved in every annual and central conference. I think a lot of people dismissed it before they considered it, just because it was, in theory, more complicated to pass. So then that left the one church plan, which most of the United States would say, and the Council of Bishops also approved, or they kind of recommended the one church plan. And this basically would remove the exclusionary language, which would mean that pastors would be able to officiate same-sex weddings, and they could still not. So you had the option as a clergy person whether you were going to be affirming or not. And then same when it comes to ordination, is the language would be removed that would exclude, but at the same time it didn't put any protection in place for LGBTQ persons. So anyone who was centrist thought this was a great option because it might bring some traditional folks, it might bring some progressive folks. Progressive folks would say it didn't go far enough. And so that was kind of the three plans. But a lot of people had their stock in the one church plan because it would faithfully allow spaces like Great Plains, which has a diversity of theological perspectives. It would allow them to be themselves, local church-wise, annual conference-wise. It gave more flexibility. And so 3 days happened, and perhaps to some people's surprise, not to others, but the traditional plan is what was voted upon and approved at that general conference, which would then be put forth as what would be adopted in 2020. So it was devastating, not only for LGBTQ persons in ministry and who wanted to be married in the Methodist Church, but for anyone really wanting to keep the space together, keep the Methodist Church together. The traditional plan was inherently divisive and was not going to do that. So then that was February of 2019. And in response to this special session of General Conference, Grace United Methodist Church responded with church council basically said a survey needs to go out. We need to figure out where our members are at. And I kind of inherited that recommendation. And so when I arrived, a survey was created and it was distributed to everyone in the congregation, both members, regular attenders, and community members, to kind of see what the Grace family's response was. And so their response to the traditional plan becoming kind of the law of the land was that, scrolling up to my notes, so of the 90 folks who participated, about 74% of people said that they strongly disagree with the traditional plan being the faithful step forward in the UMC. And on top of that, 10% said they disagreed. So about 85% were in the we disagree with the traditional plan category of Grace UMC. And then details, we kind of asked more questions about that. So regarding personal beliefs, I think the traditional plan is an accurate reflection of my personal beliefs. A total of, again, about 85% of Grace UMC members said that they disagreed with that statement. And so with that, we created a task force called, it ended up being named the Forward with Grace Task Force, which had 10 members on it, and they were charged with not only offering recommendations to church council in regards to next steps denominationally and for us as a local church, but it also provided education around LGBTQ inclusion. And so we've had a few events come out of that. Bruce and I led a history of human sexuality over the last 50 years conversation. We've done a 6-week book study on LGBTQ inclusion in the Bible. So different things have come about from that task force perspective. And so then all of this is leading up to the new year, 2020. And 2020, I think it actually was December of 2019. It was just before the new year. This news was released that a kind of small group of folks had decided to join together based on the leadership of the bishop from Sierra Leone, John Yambazu. Is that how you pronounce his name? So he kind of invited persons from all across the theological spectrum. So traditionalists, people a part of the WCA, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, centrists, progressives, LGBTQ members, folks a part of the Reconciling Ministries Network, which is the kind of caucus for LGBTQ members in clergy leadership. So they gathered, and this conversation was moderated by Kenneth R. Feinberg, who he is a Jewish man of faith. So he had no vested interest at all in the UMC's kind of predicament. But he said that he had this deep love for religion and wanted to see this faith-based organization like ours reach some kind of agreement. And so he volunteered his time completely to this conversation. And he was somebody who had administered a ton of other kind of high-profile compensation programs. One, most notably, is in the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. So he was appointed by the Bush administration to lead that mediation. And so incredibly qualified and somebody that I don't think an agreement could have been reached without his leadership. So a group was gathered and it was very hush-hush. No one really knew that this group was convening, and an agreement was met. And this agreement is called the Protocol for Separation. And basically, the gist of the protocol is that the kind of United Methodist Church, the kind of main UMC, would remain as is structurally, and then the kind of conservative, more traditional folks, so the WCA would be the big kind of group of that, would be able to separate with grace. And so that's kind of the intention of the protocol, is that there would be this gracious exit for folks who wanted to leave the UMC. And then financially, kind of what would happen with that is, I believe it's $25 million from the General Council on Finance and Administration. That was what Bruce talked about, one of our agencies focused on the finance of the church. So $25 million would go towards the kind of traditionalist Methodist denomination, so those who would exit, and people would say the WCA, that organization they've already created, would have $25 million to graciously exit. And then $2 million would be allocated if any other additional Methodist denominations would want to form. And so it gives people choice, but if there is no vote that happens, or if your local church or annual conference does literally nothing, you will stay in the United Methodist Church. And the intention of that is there would be the removal of the exclusionary language. And so the premise of the UMC would be a posture of inclusion and not exclusion. So a lot of details that have kind of been changed because of COVID. And so we were supposed to meet in May of 2020. This protocol was going to go forward. And then there was a kind of process that needed to happen after it was hopefully accepted. But our timelines changed. But basically what would happen under the protocol is annual conferences and central conferences. So annual conferences in the US, central conferences in Africa would be able to vote whether they want to stay or leave. And so for the central conferences outside the United States, they have to vote with a 2/3 vote to affiliate with a new Methodist denomination. Again, if that vote fails, they stay in the UMC. For annual conferences in the United States, there would be a vote of 20% of the members of the annual conference would say, we just want to entertain a vote. So if we get 20%, then there's a vote. That vote held would have to have a 57% approval to affiliate with another Methodist denomination. Again, if it fails, the premise is you're in the UMC. You stay, you remain. And then it gives opportunity for local churches, if they don't agree with what their annual conference vote was, they are able to, with their church council, actually, they can determine whether they want a simple majority, 2/3 majority, whatever it might be, but they can vote whether they want to affiliate with one of these new Methodist denominations. And so it gives context, well, it names that there's context. Local churches are different, annual conferences, central conferences are different. But the premise is that if no vote is passed, you remain in the United Methodist Church, which would have a posture of inclusion. The last two things I'll say about that, and then Bruce has been involved in these conversations. So a total of $39 million was agreed upon to go towards supporting communities historically marginalized by the sin of racism. So in this negotiation, while there was this conversation about the separation that would happen, it also talked about how we historically have harmed different intersections in our own church family. And so $13 million from the traditional Methodist Church, and then $26 million from the kind of the UMC that would exist after the separation. So for a total of $39 million over 8 years would go towards supporting historically marginalized communities. And then the last detail I'll say is that in the meantime, so this was brought forth December of 2019, and then in theory, May of 2020 would have been the vote. In that limbo time, the protocol included a moratorium on any trials. So basically what that would mean, if you are an LGBTQ person who is a part of the ordination process and a complaint is filed against you, the bishop has kind of those in leadership and those supporting the protocol have agreed to put a moratorium on trials. And then that would include also pastors who officiate same-sex weddings. There would be a moratorium on trials. So it kind of is, as our district superintendent shared, we're all living into the spirit of the protocol. And our Bishop of Great Plains Conference said in January that he would not do trials. And so he personally committed to following the spirit of the protocol. So that's my word vomit. Bruce was a part of these conversations as the Council of Bishops. And so what are your reflections and thoughts?
Let me put it in context. In 2004, bishops preside at General Conference. And in 2004, I was asked to be the presider when this issue came to the floor. And I presided all morning, was happy that noon was coming because I was going to be finished. And the person that was responsible, a lay person who was responsible for selecting from the bishops who was going to preside in the afternoon, as he approached the podium, came by and said, "Like it or not, you're on for this afternoon." And so I was the first bishop to ever preside at a full morning and afternoon session of General Conference. That was a tough journey, but I learned something in watching all the dynamics, and that is convinced that separation is not bad. And I think my realization in 2004 was a growing realization of the church globally, that there's nothing wrong with separation. If the reason, when you're together, if you're being diverted from your mission by a particular issue, why not go your separate ways so that your energy can be used for God's mission in the world, not over your difference of opinion. And I think that was growing. The only other thing I would say about the protocol for separation going forward is it is very significant that the person who put that idea together and called the groups together was from Africa, from Sierra Leone. Tragically, a month ago, was killed died as a result of an automobile accident in Sierra Leone. But an African bishop said, in Africa, we can separate, and some conferences will go with the UMC, some conferences will go with the new denomination, but we will both be stronger because we will not be discussing our differences of opinion over human sexuality. So the leadership for the protocol for a way forward came from the continent of Africa, which I think is indicative of the future of the United Methodist Church as a global denomination.
Absolutely. And so we say all of these things, like, again, this has been a 50-year conversation, and while all of these decisions are, practical and attempting to, figure out best next steps, we name that this has been painful, particularly for the LGBTQ community who have been talked about, oftentimes not welcome to that conversation, but talked about for over 5 decades. And so I think it's significant to kind of, remind ourselves where Grace UMC is at as we kind of close our time, is that, 85% of folks who participated in our survey named that they do not agree with the traditional plan, either personally or as a faithful next step for the United Methodist Church. And in turn, Grace is figuring out, we're in a limbo period. We're waiting for a general conference, which is now in 2021. But Grace UMC is still able to be Grace UMC. And I think, as Bruce said, the best part, everything we do points back to the local church. And so this is the attempt of doing something in a large scale way so that the local churches can be the local church. So again, we've covered a lot, and we're going to talk on next Tuesday about any questions you have, any of these details, and we pray that that will be a fruitful conversation. We'll also talk more about how, if you're feeling called to be a new member at Grace UMC, how you might want to be involved in that, because we spent the last, we don't know how many minutes yet, time talking about human sexuality, and when it comes to the local church and beyond, there's so much going on when it comes to our mission and who we are as Grace UMC and ways to plug in. So we'll talk about that as well. So thanks, y'all.